Hello and welcome to this AHDB webinar entitled Encouraging the Green Shoots of Recovery, Managing the Cash Flow in Your Business. I'm Wayne Brough, AHDB Knowledge Exchange Manager for Hortimentals. Before I introduce the programme and the presenters, just a few housekeeping points for those of you who are new to webinars. As you'll see, the audience is in mute throughout, but that doesn't stop you from posing a question, which I'll pick up on the next slide. The webinar will last about an hour, give or take 5 minutes, and it will be recorded. So if you do need to leave or if you need to pass it on to colleagues for information, it will be available on the HD website sometime a little later next week. There's also a handout which accompanies this webinar, and I'll come to that on the next slide as to how to download it, so you've got it for information. So in terms of questions, handouts and access, it should be the view you're seeing as an attendee in terms of the menu. If you want to minimize the box, there's a little red button at the top with a white arrow, so you can click that and that will downsize it, minimize it, so you've only got the 3 or 4 icons showing. Before you do so, if you wish to pose a question, then click on the white downward arrow next to the questions box, which will expand. And as you can see there in that example, you can type in your question. Please submit questions throughout the webinar, and I will look out for them, and then I will pose them to the appropriate speaker at the end of their presentation. Along with that, if you click the downward white arrow next to the handout, you will see the handout, which contains all the slides from both presentations are collected in that document. So if you wish to have that as reference, please download that at your leisure during the presentation. As I said there, if you do need to sort of come back to the presentation at a later date, there is the link there to the archive site on the AHDB website. In terms of today's webinar program, those with eagle eyes will notice we've had a slight change of running order here. And we've got Neil Wilson, who will be going first with dealing with banks and securing funding. And then Martin will follow up talking about tips and tactics to manage cash flow in your business. As I say, questions will be taken at the end of each section. Those who don't know Neil and Martin, just a few words of introduction before we commence the presentations. Neil comes from a farm in southwest of Scotland, and after obtaining a degree in agriculture from the University of Edinburgh, ventured into banking and finance. He spent 23 years working for Clydeside Bank and HSB across roles, most of which are connected with agriculture, and most recently as head of agriculture HSB. Neil left banking last year and now works as an independent advisor to the farming and food businesses. Martin has been involved in ornamental horticulture for 30 years since graduating from Y College. Has spent the last 7 years spent 7 years in consultancy with ADAS and a private consultancy, followed by various managerial and ownership roles in production nurseries, experiencing the highs and the lows along the way. Martin's extensive practical experience of production, marketing, and multiple supply chains. So if I can ask Martin just to close his webcam and mute his microphone, and we'll start commence proceedings with Neil's presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Wayne, and good afternoon, everyone. So as Wayne said, we're going to be talking about how we deal with banks and secure funding in uncertain times, and I'm not sure we've ever been in more uncertain times than we are now. Wayne gave a brief introduction there, so I'm not going to go over it again, and let's just dive straight in. So what we're really trying to do here is to help prepare you for any conversations you want to have with a bank in terms of additional funding for your business. And I think one of the ideal ways of doing that is almost trying to get you to step into the bank manager's shoes and understand what they might be looking for from you. So let's start. When I look back at my banking days, the acronym CAMPARI was one that pretty much all of the banks will look at as a structure for how they will analyse any sort of lending proposition. As you can see here, CAMPARI is the character, ability, means, purpose, amount, repayment, and insurance. And we'll go through them in a little bit more detail as the presentation goes on. But hopefully the first thing I can get out to you the bank want to look at the people in the business in the first instance. What are the management like? What's the ability of them? How is the business structured? What experience is there? You know, those are really key elements of how a bank will want to look at a business. And when I went out to see businesses, I really wanted to know, well, why are you doing what you're doing? And a not why bit, there's a little bit of recommended viewing there. A guy called, some management guy called Simon Sinek. If you've got a chance, look at that. It's a sort of 10-minute video, but it starts to give you an idea about why businesses sometimes do what they do. But I was always interested in, well, what do you want to do with your business? Where do you want to take it? You know, what's the purpose of it? How are you developing it? All of those sorts of things. So you think the same way when you're starting to speak to your bank about what your business is really about. And let's not kid ourselves on, it's a bank. Financials are important, but will come later. So let's look a bit more, delve a bit deeper into this management team idea and the characters in the business. So put yourselves in the bank manager's shoes. What would you want to know about a business you were going to deal with? Critically, who are the decision makers? You know, what do they do in the business? Who are they? What sort of things do they do? And also, what are their reputation? You know, if a bank manager is well connected in your area, they might already, if they aren't dealing with you already, they might have already heard about you and your business and are starting to build up an idea of what you and your business are like. But it's always worthwhile you talking about that, how you see that looking. You know, have you been invited to talk at things like AHDB seminars? Have you been invited to share your knowledge with other people? That's always good ways of showing and building up what your reputation might be. And what's your attitude to business? Are you really, you know, are you really going for it? Are you out there trying to make the best of it? Or are you sitting back a bit more? You know, again, the bank's looking for people that are really pushing on with their business and really want to take it forward. And track record's really important, and it's not all about financial track record. You know, you might be sitting there thinking, yeah, well, you know, the bank gets a copy of my annual accounts every year so they can see my track record. Speak a bit more about your business track record, sort of things like your decision making. I always was impressed when I heard about a business talking about how they had managed, or business people talking about how they managed through really difficult times. So this was a really challenging period. Prices were low, you know, we weren't making much cash, and here's things that I did in my business to improve it and to turn things around. It's always good, because then that lets the bank see, well, actually, goodness, we'll get somebody here who, even under the greatest of pressure, can really come up with good decisions to make sure their business can continue to move forward. And again, a little bit, you know, demonstrate a bit about your ability. And again, what I talked about earlier, ambitions, goals, where do you want to take the business? And again, it's good to talk to the bank about that, because what you want to sort of start that runway of conversation, you might be asking for money now, but if you continue to want to grow the business, you might want to come back to the bank in 5 years' time for more. So really what you're doing now is you're kind of letting them know that these things might be coming down the track, and you will get a feel, as will the bank, about what sort of things you might need to do in the interim to get to that place. The bank will also want to know who is part of the business. Lots of times when I went out, there might be a business with 4 or 5 partners or 4 or 5 directors, and really as the bank, you maybe only dealt with 1 or 2 of those. I was always keen to make sure that everybody who was involved in the management of that business was aware of what was going on and what risks they were taking. So even if these are people who won't necessarily be part of every bank meeting, I think it's important that you reflect that they are part of your business. And I think those last 2 points about management meetings and professional involvement, you know, how do you share the information in your business, and how do you create the ideas? How do you take the advice in from accountants or professional advisors? Do you have a non-executive director? Is there a chairman of a board? You know, how are all those pieces of the jigsaw pulling together to make sure that the management team are as strong as they can possibly be? Because ultimately, it's the decisions that management team make that will make sure that the business continues to flourish. And when I delve a bit deeper into ability, I break it down into two areas. The first is sort of professional ability. And I always wanted to look at things like what was the qualifications or the education of the management team. And that doesn't necessarily need to be formal education, could be learning on the job, but you know, what elements have they really pushed on to learn and gather knowledge on. Be able to demonstrate your technical knowledge, and that might be through a little bit of benchmarking about how technically the business performs, and that you really know your subject matter and what skills you've got. Again, I touched on that idea earlier about embracing change. You know, if things change rapidly in business like they've done this year, for good or for bad, are you able to take that on and continue to make decisions that help drive your business forward? And finally, I was always, on the professional element, I was always interested in the CPD, so the continuous professional development of the individuals in that management team. So things like attending this AHDB Horticulture webinar, as an example, getting out and about, hearing other business speakers, just making sure that you're picking up what's going on in business at that particular time. Get those things out. You don't need to write masses and masses about them, but just a few bullet points here and there about those sorts of things. And I did say we'd come back to finances. Financial ability is important. How do you do your strategic planning and budgeting? Do you do it yourself? Who helps you? How do you monitor it? And most importantly, how do you implement it? So often, as a banker, I would go out and we'd sit and go through a strategic plan and a budget, and we'd agree it, and the bank would say yes, and that was great, and off we went. And the next thing I knew, the management had put the strategic plan and budget in the bottom drawer, and it never saw the light of day again, until a few months later, a question or two was asked about why something had gone awry, and actually we found out that the plan hadn't been properly implemented. So I think demonstrate how you would make sure that that was implemented. And again, we touched on benchmarking under technical knowledge. Financial benchmarking is good, you know, using AHDB figures, or if you're in benchmarking groups, using them. Again, it's to try and show the bank, actually, look, I'm a good performer against my peer group. You know, I'm in the top 25%, or wherever you might sit in there. Again, it's another encouragement to the banker to go, right, okay, look, you know, we're a good business, we're looking at all of these metrics, and we understand where we sit. I think one of the most important ones for me is the COP, cost of production. I'll flash it up on the screen for you. I think that's how important it is. You really need to understand the cost of what you're producing, whether that's potatoes, ornamentals, or widgets. It doesn't really matter. If you can demonstrate to the bank you understand what your costs are of producing, you know, what you put out the door, then that's a brilliant starting point. And why is it so important? Well, it helps you understand where you sit in the business world that you are in, but also it helps you think about, well, we live in volatile times, and how am I going to be able to cope with the ups and downs of business? And I think this is a very good example of how this can work. If you look at the squiggly blue line, that's commodity prices, and it doesn't matter what commodity it is, but you know, we all know that prices go up and down and move around about, and we don't always expect to see them coming. And then we have red, amber, and green lines, which reflect different levels of cost of production. So if you're a red line producer, that in my mind is, you know, you have a high cost of production, it's a high cost setup. From my perspective as a banker, I'd be looking at that going, oh, goodness me, I've got some concerns here over the productivity and the competitiveness of this business. And I would say almost certainly as well around about the cost management in that company. If you look at that red line, you know, prices need to be really high during a cycle for that business to make any kind of money at all. So if you're a red line producer and you come and ask me for money, I'm going to be scratching my head immediately if it turns out that you're high cost. How is this business going to afford this borrowing? If you're an amber producer, you're kind of in the middle. It's probably a fairly stable place to be. Most people, I suspect, will be in that world. You know, start considering your price risk management because you're a little bit exposed to what prices are going to do, and certainly look at the cost structure of the business. You're in a place where I suspect you could improve, but you're in the middle. Sometimes you're making money, sometimes you're not. I suspect that's where, and I know that's where most businesses will end up being. If you're a green producer, that's brilliant. Low cost of production. You're able to manage volatility, and these businesses tend to retain cash, and they are the ones that also tend to grow. And if you look at it in this scenario, the green cost of producer, the green producer with the low cost of production is the last one to lose money in a downturn. They're the first one to start making money when prices are in an upward move, and therefore they lose the least and gain the most. And you know, usually in times of distress, they're the business that can go out and buy the red line producer at a discount. So that's just a little bit on cost of production. I think we all know what means are. That tends to be your stake in the business, your net worth, effectively. Banks tend to look at, certainly when I was in the bank, I tended to look at, you know, an ideal scenario was an ownership percentage of over 50%. Why was that? Well, you know, that was a good balance sheet, tended to be a relatively low gearing in the business, and also there was a buffer there. So if tough times came along, the balance sheet could help the business through any difficult times. Don't take that as a given. I mean, I have lent money to businesses with 20% ownership in the past for particular reasons. I'm just saying that's an ideal scenario to be in. If you're not there, the bank will probably ask for more information to help them come to a decision. And look at, if it's startups, the bank will tend to look at cash and assets available. Now, it's pretty important that you can get across to the bank what the finance is for. If you are on a capital expenditure project, it might be for land purchase or some new kit or a new unit. Just make sure you're very clear with the bank how much you want and exactly what it is for. You should know you're doing it, but it's really about getting that message through to the bank. If you are on an expansion exercise, do not forget about working capital. You would be amazed at how often a business would buy land, for example, and invest some money in there, and suddenly then go to plant up and think, oh, I don't have the money to do it. So think about that bigger picture of how this all goes together. And again, if you're expanding or diversifying, or it's for succession planning, again, all of these, get over to the bank how it's going to help the business. An example for succession planning might be, look, I've got a sibling in the business. We're not necessarily agreeing on everything. I want to buy them out. It will help our business. Yes, okay, we might need to borrow to do it, but it will help the decision making in our business, and we will be able to progress over the longer term. So just some things to think about there in terms of what the finance is for. Ultimately, the bank will want to know, is it legal and legitimate, and what's it going to do to help your business? Those are the keys. Now, this might sound a bit silly, but are you asking for enough? Again, I go back to the point I raised a moment or two ago. You are expanding operations. You've worked out the capital that you require to build a new unit. You've built your new unit, and then actually you go to put stuff in it, and you've got no money to do it. So just make sure you think about the longer element of the run through of that business. So, and banks, I as a banker always would prefer you to ask for enough on day one. You know, I never liked having to go through the whole process of going, well, actually, we gave this customer the money, but we didn't get it right, and now we need some more to make sure things are moving on and the business can operate effectively. Could it be too much? On the other hand, if you've got a project that's going to cost you £250,000, if you go asking the bank for £500,000 and can't fill in the gaps about why that other £250,000 is required, the likelihood is the bank's going to scratch their head and actually might turn out saying no because they don't really understand what you're asking for. So again, it's about getting the pitch right there and you really understanding what you need and why you need it. And what the bank can help you with that, but they won't really be able to do it for you. As well, banks are not big fans of doing 100% funding for things. So put in, if you have some cash to put in, make sure they know that. But alternatively, you might have a big asset position, you might have plenty of land, you might have very little cash. Actually bringing some of that land into the deal in the equation can help. Talking a little bit how you might want to structure some of that borrowing, the bank will definitely be able to help guide you on this, but just for now, so you know some of the options that are available. If you are buying land or undertaking a big capital project, say a new unit, for example, you might want to fund that on a term loan over 10 or 15, 20 years, kind of like a mortgage. This is a long-term asset. You want to spread the payment out over a longer period of time to help cash flow. Fine. If you have a very cyclical business, again, an overdraft for cash flow purposes might be something to help. I would just say, try and make sure that your overdraft account runs in and out of credit and debit balances to make sure it's been used properly. If you sell product to some blue chip companies, which is great, you know the money's going to come, but they might take 60 or 90 days to pay you. And I know Martin's going to talk a little bit about that, but one of the products that might help release some cash for you is invoice financing. Again, speak to the bank about that. In effect, what they will do is release some cash to your business against the debtor book that you have, and it can be very, very effective at ironing out some ups and downs in cash flow. If you do some international trade, you might want to look at other trade finance things, letters of credit, such like some currency financing if you're having to trade in euros or dollars. And if you're buying some kit, there are things like hire purchase or lease options. Again, banks will be able to talk to you in a lot more detail about that, but this really just for today, it was to give you a high level view of some of the things that might be appropriate for your type of business. Crucial that we can repay it. So again, what are the bank going to look for? They'll look at the financial track record. So that is your financial accounts. How have they looked? How successful have you been or otherwise? I would say now pretty much for any sizable or I suppose any real request to the bank for additional funding, they would like to see financial forecasts. And what I would say, when you're providing forecasts, profitability, cash flow, how the capital might flow for a particular project, that's great, but try and do a common sense test on them. How does it relate to your previous performance in business? And so if you've been making excellent profits for years and years and years, and then you show a forecast which continues that trend, that's great. If you've had a very patchy track record with a few years of losses and bits of profit here and there, and suddenly you show top 1% future performance, if I was the bank manager, I would probably be asking you some questions about that. So just be prepared, be true to yourself in that regard. And again, some benchmarking can help show the bank where you and your business sit in your peer comparison group. And again, that can be quite powerful as well. Other things to think about is how do you deal with the volatility? We touched on that earlier in the cost of production element. But again, just building that into how you might repay, and do you have any contracts in place, and how does the cash flow from them? I would always like to see a sensitivity analysis as a bank manager. It's the what if scenario. What if I lose a crop? What if a key member of staff decides to leave? How do I deal with that? What impact might it have? What if there's price changes? What if I suddenly need to pay for stuff in 30 days instead of 60? How what impact might that have, and then how might I deal with it? How do we repay? What are the sources of repayment? Well, for the majority of people, it's going to be profits and cash that you generate in your normal course of business. But look, you might have other assets out to the side somewhere that are non-core, and you might say, well, look, at the right time, I'm going to sell that. I'm going to sell that asset, I'm going to bring it in, and I'll repay this borrowing. So don't be scared to talk about that as a potential repayment source. Sometimes what you might need to think about, again, I'll go back to this, if you build a new unit, for example, and it might take a year or two to really get the business up to full speed in that unit, you might ask the bank to not pay capital for a couple of years around about that. And then again, we touched on this earlier, how long to repay, what can you afford, what can you not afford? And then how do you protect yourself? What risks do you want to accept? Can you hedge your sales? Can you cover off your input costs? Can you fix interest rates? Can you hedge your currency? Again, for you to decide what risks you want to accept. And the bank might actually ask you some questions around about that, depending how tight they feel that might be. Now let's go on to the big thing, security. Your security, loads and loads of security to a bank does not make a bad proposal good. If your business plan does not look great, offering the bank, 5 times security cover is probably not going to change their mind. The bank takes security to cover things that might go wrong, unknowns. It takes security to protect its lending. When I was at the bank, we wanted to see borrowing repaid from cash flow. And we never ever wanted to get involved in having to take security to repay. So, that's what it is. It's a safety net. There are different types of security. Most people will think property, but you could also have stocks and shares. You might have, a parental guarantee, or you might have cash tied up somewhere that you want to bring in to that. And again, another sort of insurance is life and critical illness cover, which you might take out on yourself or key workers to make sure that if accidents happen, that the next generation isn't financially caught up in that. So we talked there really about business plans. Your objective is to provide evidence to demonstrate to the bank that your business will be successful. And in my experience, those who produce plans are excellent and progressive managers like yourself, or poorly performing operators who the bank have asked to do a plan for them. If somebody's doing the plan for you, make sure you understand it and you can talk to the bank about it. And don't take things for granted. Even if you're sitting in front of a bank manager who knows something about horticulture, they don't know absolutely everything. Make sure you get everything across. And a sort of final sort of warning word, there's a lot of regulatory change in banking, so please watch for terms and conditions that come out to you, and things like 20-year loans. Banks are maybe only going to give you 5-year commitments on them now. So please just keep an eye on any documentation that comes out and read it properly. Other things to be aware of, big issues around about sustainability and climate change in the environment just now, as you know. If you get caught up in an environmental situation and you're found guilty of causing environmental damage or of ignoring laws, the likelihood is that you will get a phone call from the bank asking some very, very searching questions around about it. So to summarise, put yourself forward, show yourself in a good light, demonstrate to the bank your personal abilities as well as your financial abilities, and make sure that you provide the evidence that they just cannot turn you down. And with that, that is me. Thank you very much, and I'll pass back now to Wayne.
Thank you, Neil. That's great. We have got a question here. If you have an ongoing overdraft, at what point would you speak to the bank about changing this into a loan?
I think you could speak to the bank at any time about an overdraft, moving to a loan. If you think there's maybe a lump of hardcore in there, or you might have bought some fixed assets through an overdraft, then do it at any time. I would normally say, overdrafts tend to be reviewed once a year anyway. if you feel you can wait to that time, it might just tie everything together nicely and be prepared for that conversation. But yeah, at any time, I don't, there wouldn't be a good time or a bad time, but probably the best time when the banker wanting to do the review of the overdraft facility anyway.
Okay, thank you. I've got one as well, and I don't know how much you want to expand on it, but are there any banks more sympathetic to horticulture than others in your experience?
In terms of banks, I don't think particular banks, but what I would say is you will find particular bank managers who understand particular sectors better, and sometimes it's about getting out there and networking and actually, and I know it can be a bit time consuming, but interviewing a few bank managers initially to get a feel for how much they know about the sector you're in. Banks want, their business is lending money, and the job of a bank manager is projecting your story to the bank to make sure that they will support the business. If you find somebody who understands your industry and therefore is likely to understand your business better, then that's a big plus. So I think it's more about the people on the ground necessarily rather than the HSBC or Barclays or NatWest brand that goes behind it.
Great, thanks for that, Neil. Just to stick to time, I'll leave it at 2 questions for now. If we've got any time at the end, we can pick any more up. Can I now ask Martin to get ready, and we'll pass over to Martin for his presentation, looking at tips and tactics to manage cash flow in your business. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I've entitled my little segment here, Horticulture as a Pennies Business, and the sort of thing I'm angling at there is that we are a high volume, low margin and price sensitive industry, whether you're growing ornamentals, fruit or veg. We're producing, let's say 100,000 units or something, and the emphasis here is trying to keep more pennies on your side of the fence and in your pocket and out of suppliers and customers' pockets. So that's the thesis I'm going to run through in this presentation. A quick bit about my background, 30 years in the ornamental horticulture industry, a mixture of consultancy and practical roles in production, sales management in the food and ornamental supply chains. So cash flow problems, what are they and the practical challenges you face? And Neil's run us through it excellently there, the banking view. I'm sure some of you have come across 1 or 2 of these problems at certain times, whether it be your spring cash flow period in the ornamental sector, where you've got a lot of stock and you're waiting to be paid. It could be creditors owing you money. Sometimes it might be you've got a large VAT bill coming up. And one of the areas we don't often focus on that creates cash flow problems is the lack of profitability in the business. And as Neil's emphasised, banks are not keen to lend to businesses that are not performing. Maybe it's a high cost of production, maybe it's high wastage. So what can we do, and how do we balance the cash flow with the profitability? So how do we navigate these cash flow problems? And I think the key thing is here is being in control of your cash flow. So not being a passenger of whatever comes in the bank from customers, whatever bills are due take you. And with your clear plan you've got, a clear cash flow projection you've got, knowing exactly when your key cash flow pinch points are. It could be in the springtime, and it may only be for a matter of 2 or 3 weeks or a month waiting for a big check to come in from a customer from Christmas or that sort of thing. And make sure you're perfectly on top of managing cash flow day to day around that, discussing your accounts team with your accounts team and that sort of thing. Inevitably, as we trade forward, there's going to be some balance of cash flow against profit. And all the way through, there are many decisions you can take where that they're a bit mutually exclusive. One sacrifices the other. So to address some of the areas that we can look at of low profitability, I'm going to focus on the internal sources of cash. And by that, I mean areas you can do something about, things you can influence and things you can manage, as opposed to external sources of cash from banks and lenders and investors, which Neil's covered already. So what are these internal sources of cash in the business? Well, I'm going to look at your customers, so invoices due to you, your suppliers, your workforce, your growing stock, your assets, so your land, your buildings and machinery, and your overhead costs. First of these is your customers, and sometimes it's quite tricky to talk about profitability and cash flow with your customers. Maybe there's a little bit of embarrassment about it, but it's really, really important that we take the customers with you on your journey of particularly managing tight cash flow periods. You would be amazed how many businesses don't actually invoice on time, and by that I mean there's a week or 2 weeks delay between product being delivered. Maybe they're waiting for delivery notes to come back, and sometimes they're inaccurately invoiced, so there's been a credit due that hasn't been issued. So in making sure your invoices are raised as quickly as possible, on time and accurately, so that your customers can pay them as quickly as possible is really important. With your existing debtor book, the money owed to you, it's not embarrassing to chase for payment if they're being slow payers to you, and make sure you've got a really strong process. So maybe a regular phone call, maybe what the old letter cycle or email cycle on overdue accounts. And really, if they are being slow beyond 90 days, then get on the phone and try and arrange a bespoke payment program over 3 months or 4 months. In terms of new business going forward, you may want to consider particular pinch points around your peak cash flow, offering prepayment discounts or early settlement discounts for invoices. For instance, a 2.5% discount for a settlement on 14 days. That gets the cash in your business. You've clearly sacrificed 2.5% on your profit of that sale, but you've got the cash flow in there. Pricing is clearly a very important part of the matrix here, and Neil's looked at the cost of production, and I can't emphasize any more the importance of understanding in detail your cost of production, and indeed your cost of delivery, your cost of marketing the product as well. Reviewing prices and setting prices, it's really important that from a cash flow perspective that payment terms are part of this mix. And just as an example, should the price for, let's say, 10 trolleys of pansies be the same if you're going to be paid in 10 days or 120 days? And the answer is there should be a pricing difference there, and sometimes we don't always reflect that. In terms of the cost of production, we need to make sure all real cost increases are being passed on, and there's a bit of uncertainty at the moment about Brexit input costs and customs costs, transport's going in one direction and minimum wages, and making sure all of those are rolled into the true cost of production and the pricing we're passing on. And sometimes volume discounts are given just because it's volume, but maybe there's not necessarily an actual cost saving there to justify that. I would also, with your customer base, urge you to look at credit insurance. It's perceived as expensive. I think prices are coming down, particularly important if you're dealing with larger blue chip companies, supermarkets, big retailers, big wholesalers. One of the downsides is often that credit insurance can get withdrawn if the customer's accounts are particularly bad, but this should give you a big red flag about the viability of dealing with that customer. And certainly for businesses that are going through a high growth trajectory, invoice discounting or invoice financing is referenced by Neil as well. This is where you sell 80% of your invoice book for 80% of the cash flow, probably in a week, and get the remaining balance for 20% when they are paid less a percentage or two. A very, very interesting and useful tool for fast growing businesses. So what can we do in terms of managing cash from a your supplier's perspective? And here I'm focusing on the suppliers of your products that you're growing. So maybe you can shop around and find early season discounts, ordering 3 or 4 months early. I think in the COVID world we're in at the moment, it's definitely worth reassessing and realigning your supply chain, shopping around. Different businesses have had different impacts on their cost base, on their efficiency. Some people are going to be the compost market is particularly prone to imports from Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, and Brexit and customs. And there are going to be some challenges in that market. So it's definitely worth shopping around for all your pots, fertilizers, young plant materials, and challenge whether it's your nursery managers or your buying teams who are involved to do that as well. Just like the different price for paying quickly or being paid quickly by your customers, maybe you can agree a quick payment discount if you pay the supplier in 10 days if you've got cash to do that, or indeed can you have a price for 120-day delayed payment if you need to stretch the payment with your suppliers. It's also a good time to sort of challenge the key assumptions in the business. And are you growing can you change your peat mixes? Can you use bigger or smaller plug sizes, different pot sizes, different cropping densities, planting densities, different timings? Can you bring things in different minimum order quantities? One area I see with suppliers is perhaps if you've been dealing with them for a long time, you've got a fixed credit limit that's been in place for a number of years, and sometimes your supplier's accounts department are chasing for payment so you can have your next delivery, and the solution may be just to agree a larger credit limit with them so they're not on the phone chasing for that payment. And if you are in trouble around your pinch points, then pick up the phone and discuss plans with your suppliers. Try and negotiate a way through 3 or 4 or 5 month payments if you can. And definitely look at managing the euro or dollar currency exchange risks. With Brexit around the corner, maybe buying ahead for certainty is better than taking a floating price. Your workforce is clearly a very large and very necessary part of the business mix, and in a labour-intensive industry like horticulture, it's quite a significant cost. And they're one that doesn't really like the delayed payment method either, unfortunately. So with hourly and weekly paid staff, is there any scope for reducing hours for a few weeks or a few months, particularly at certain times of the year? I know a number of businesses who use a sort of average weekly pay plan. So the hours worked may vary between 20 and 32 and 35, and they're paid the same amount of hours and work on a sort of hours debit and credit basis through the year. So your team member gets the same income every month and you have the same cost every month. I'm sure most businesses are considering use of agency or do use agency workers for the extreme peaks of demand at harvest or at packing or at Christmas or peak ornamental dispatch times, but definitely considering more agency uses where possible. One key area that's often overlooked is the cost of absenteeism and sick rates. Generally speaking, it's 1 or 2 problem people who have abnormally high sick rates. These are definitely problems that need resolving through reference to grievance and disciplinary procedures, contracts, and following the sort of warning cycle, and seeking fit notes and fitness for work notes as well. Specifically in these COVID times, I think furloughs worked quite well for a large number of horticultural businesses, and we don't know what the various flavours of that are going to be into next year, but definitely consider using furlough schemes if you can. One of the byproducts too is there's a lot of newly set up freelance marketing and management professionals in the marketplace now, so you can consider them as an extra pair of hands for very specific short-term business management projects, marketing projects, that sort of thing. And one area to prevent, to get the most out of your key staff, and particularly where it's ones that have a very specific responsibility. It may be payroll, it may be in the maintenance department, it may be specific areas, but make sure there is at least someone else who knows how to do their role if they're off self-isolating or off ill for a prolonged period of time. Just makes good practice, but I think COVID has brought that to the fore with the number of people who have been missing from businesses for various isolation reasons. If you are up against the ropes, then restructuring and redundancy is a potential last resort option. It's sometimes, I was involved with a business once where they were forced to make 30% of the staff redundant, and the remaining 70% felt it was almost impossible to run the business. And 2 weeks later, it was almost a question of where were those 30%. And I think there is sometimes extreme actions like that, even if you're just considering theoretical redundancies, do stimulate the creativity there. And obviously with your labour costs, opportunities for automation and mechanisation of high repeat tasks. They're not necessarily the big capital projects, it may be small tools and improvements. One of the big areas is lean, and I can't recommend highly enough the lean and continuous improvement process. It's a process that came out of the automotive industry and has been quite widely adopted by a number of horticultural businesses, and AHDB itself has a smart hort hub. There's more information on the website, and leaning your work processes to eliminate the waste. And I won't run through them all here, but particularly reducing unnecessary movements and unnecessary waiting times and that sort of thing. There are some significant savings available in high labour cost environments, in pack houses, in harvesting and that sort of thing. Fourth one is managing your stock for cash flow, so the amount of cash you have tied up in your stock, and I'm talking about growing stock and indeed your dry goods here. So using just-in-time deliveries to keep your consumables to a minimum, so you're not tying up cash in stock is great, but you might have to look at the trade-off between the cost price there and perhaps paying a little bit more, but keeping more cash in the bank. Just as I was referring to good invoice procedures, you also need good goods inwards procedures. And again, I'm amazed at the number of businesses where they don't necessarily know what was in stock or how long it's been there, and it takes a long time to match up invoices with goods received notes or delivery notes and work out what you owe. Being in control of that, your creditor book there is really, really important. Perhaps looking at modifying production plans in terms of timing, bigger plants later, smaller plants earlier, whatever your crops are, and challenging those assumptions. Certainly with hardy nursery stock and field grown trees and that sort of thing, there may be the opportunity to sell off old or non-core production stock that's been hanging around a bit that's not core to your customers. Clearly, getting the most out of whatever you're growing, so minimizing production waste through excellent technical application and minimizing marketing waste through high sell-throughs of crops. That's where your profit is, and being great at what you're doing will always enhance your profitability there. Obsolete pots, trays, carry trays, labels. One of my pet hates changing barcode labels and picture labels every year. Can you sell off any of these, or at least can you recycle them or get them taken away for free collections at least? Moving on to your assets in your business, what can you do about these to conserve cash and enhance profit? Well, I'm sure a lot of nurseries and businesses have got obsolete or little used machinery that's knocking around that you could be able to sell. It could be some conveyor belts, it could be heaters, it could be boilers, it could be sprayers, old tractors, maybe a workshop full of spare parts and kits, tools that are no longer used, etc., that may be turned back into cash. There's clearly some short-term tactics of renting and hiring rather than necessarily buying forklifts, delivery vehicles, even potting machines for hiring potting machines for a 4 or 5 week period to get you through your key place, or indeed using contractors to come in and do certain jobs for you. So again, it's another trade-off of cost of doing it yourself against a third party doing it. Plan preventative maintenance across facilities, buildings, glass houses, key equipment to try and eliminate those peaky repair costs. So what you don't want if you're tight for cash is a big invoice that needs paying quickly for a new pump or a new vent motor or new business critical stuff, because lack of maintenance has led to it going wrong. If you're up against your cash flow peak, then capital purchases that are part of your plan, which will drive profitability, may have to be deferred in timing until past the cash flow, or indeed brought forward if you're sat in cash reserves and to save labour and drive those profits. Asset finance is a tool we touched on briefly there with Neil as well, which can be used to ease the burden. And are there any sort of small parcels of land you could sell off? It could be just for pony paddocks or garden extensions or land that would square up your parcel, etc. But there may be opportunities to sell off little bits of land. And the final sort of internal section is sort of managing your overheads for section. Energy at the moment is post-COVID is quite a different place for electricity and gas, particularly of those on medium-term contracts. So if you're in a 2 or 3 year fixed price contract, it may well be worth looking at even paying some early exit clauses and shopping around. Can you get a better electricity price or gas price? And oil is in a very different place too now than last winter, so it may be worth stockpiling oil ahead of the winter. Prices will inevitably go up as clarity comes to the picture and demand increases. There are a few glasshouse energy buying groups around, particularly for gas. There may be some industry-wide buying groups you can look at joining to save money on key energy costs. Certainly, there may be some fundamental changes in energy regime you can look at. So not just looking at environmental computers to damp down temperatures by 1 or 2 degrees, but perhaps some more fundamental lower energy, lower input regimes and cropping cycles that can be looked at under protection. Transport is clearly a key overhead. You've got to get your produce to your customers. If that's store delivery or depot delivery, or indeed processor delivery, then a whole range of options to cost through against owned trucks or leased trucks or Danish trolley delivery services, and make sure that all sort of surcharges for small loads or half pallets, all those sort of things are passed on to customers where possible. Insurance is an area I quite often see opportunities for saving, and I'm not talking about trying to get the same for cheaper, but actually making sure that you've got correct levels of cover. And sometimes that over insurance is as bad as under insurance. So you may find that you're going to have to pay more premium because you've been underinsured for your assets for some time. A significant number of businesses just sort of renew and have actually sold a tractor or a lorry or a van or changed a company car in a year, and that's not always taken off the policy or the policy amended. You may want to look at business interruption cover or a higher level of business interruption cover in the slightly more uncertain times we're in, although there's obviously some doubt whether COVID counts as business interruption at the moment, something to look at. And spreading your payments by direct debit rather than one lump sum is definitely worth looking at there. And just a general hint on reviewing all those, I call them dead costs sometimes, of software licenses, IT, accountants, phone contracts, mobile contracts, waste skips, maintenance provision for all sorts of things, security alarm provision, all those kind of things which we just tend to take for granted and may well be worth shopping around or paying later on there. One quick last point on overheads is with regard to HMRC, and there's been some quite generous VAT deferral schemes in the current COVID environment, and there are also potentially some significant impacts of Brexit and VAT delays if you are importing directly in euros. Please take advantage of the schemes for VAT deferment there. So that's the 6 areas I've run through for internal sources of cash in the business. It's an awful lot to control managing cash flow on a detailed basis, and I think most businesses will produce cash flow projections on a spreadsheet, and it's really quite hard to actualize those and modify those as you go along. Very easy to do cash flow projection at the start of the year, maybe on a monthly basis. There are some excellent accounting packages out there, particularly online accounting packages now, cloud-based accounting packages. This is Xero, which is highly got some really interesting functionality. But even just from your normal debtor and creditor balances and payment timings, which can of course be amended, it's producing daily cash flow production graphs. This business is lucky enough to be in credit all the time, but they will be very, very useful tools in trying to drill down on those key highlights. So in summary, the importance of the business plan and a clear direction, whether you're borrowing from the bank or not, the credible cash flow plan that goes within that really should be a key management tool. And when you've got that plan, being in control of the cash flow and managing it in detail. It may be just that pinch point of a month or so until a big payment comes in from a supplier, but it's very good discipline to get into. And knowing those pinch points and how to manage them, and indeed it's worth considering how the bank views your pinch points and how they view your cash flow management at other times of the year as well. So they won't be looking for any nasty surprises from you in cash flow terms, i.e. finding a cash flow problem that's some way off what your forecast said in terms of it's bigger than, or it's later than, or it occurs again. Look at the 6 key areas for internal sources of cash, and I think all of those I've mentioned about the trade-off between cash and profit. Hopefully there's some savings there to be made as well, which can enhance profit as well as improve cash flow. The key thing is communicating with customers and suppliers to try and manage that cash position when you come up against tight periods of cash management. Picking up the phone, talking person to person, it's all about the people, and fronting up with the problems is really good. And I would urge you certainly, if you've got a big team around, to spread the load on that, be it you're getting your buying team, your nursery manager, your maintenance guys, your sales teams involved, engaging those teams as well, so you won't be alone. And I really sincerely believe that if you look after all those pennies in the horticultural business, the horticultural pounds will follow. So I'll now hand back to Wayne.
Thank you, Martin. Just a couple of questions. I've got one here. Going back to those 6 areas of the business, which one of those has the most potential for cash flow advantages and profit, do you think, please?
In terms of cash flow, I think customers probably present us with the biggest opportunity, and it is clearly a sensitive commercial relationship with customers we're trying to balance, but they are your sort of your key lifeblood and hopefully your partners in growing your business. And I think it shouldn't be a dirty subject or a subject to be avoided. They're going to have to pay you at some stage for the goods you supply them. So trying to encourage them, incentivize them, and working with them to pay you sooner, I think, has the biggest opportunity for cash flow improvement there. I know it's tricky if it's supermarkets where terms and conditions are often imposed, but it's definitely worth having a conversation there. In terms of profit, then I think it's probably the labour, the workforce area, and particularly this process review and lean type reviews. There's an awful lot of in our very manual, high labour categories, whether it's ornamentals, fruit, veg, whether it's in the pack house, whether it's in production, at planting or at harvesting. There's definitely the most opportunity for increasing profit by looking at labour costs.
Okay, thank you. As we are approaching 4 o'clock, just one more then, just to sort of wrap up, please, Martin. And it's covering raising prices with customers, especially in the current times. Any thoughts on how people should go about it?
I think it depends on your customer sector, and clearly when you're in a pretty competitive environment, perhaps supplying supermarkets direct, then you are balancing the risk of losing a contract with making enough money. And Neil very excellently illustrated the cost of production, red, amber and green models there. You've got to be sure that you're actually making money at the price you're negotiating, but understanding that cost of production and all the add-ons, all the extra bits, the transport to hub, to depot, the minimum order quantities, the 7-day-a-week arrangements, the overtime that's going to be involved. And so it is difficult in a supermarket environment, but there is, it's not good practice to sustainably or unsustainably do business knowingly at a loss if the costs haven't been recovered there. If it's a more traditional sort of price list based business, or selling to garden centres or greengrocer shops, that sort of thing, so a number of smaller retailers, each of those will have their own demands on labelling and frequency of deliveries, minimum deliveries, different geographical locations. And I think the danger of standardised pricing is that all those nuances and bespoke bits get lost in the pricing mix. So each customer you can have a base cost of production, but when they're going to pay you what the minimum order quantity is, they all need to take into account the extras they ask and price set accordingly. And it's not a dirty word to put prices up, that there is we are in a cost inflationary period in terms of labour, transport costs going up. So yes, it's a case of discussing it openly and honestly with your customers.
Thank you for that, Martin. If I can just now move on to my final slide, just to sort of tie everything together. So just to wrap things up, just to thank both Neil and Martin for 2, which I think very comprehensive presentations. They're giving lots of detail. We didn't unfortunately manage to get Basis Neroso for this particular webinar because of the presentation content, but we have got the download, the handout to download, sorry. So you've now got a few seconds just to sort of download that particular handout if you want a copy of it before we bring the webinar to a conclusion. If there are any further questions you wish to sort of ask both speakers in the next couple of days, I'll be willing to sort of take those on board. If you want to send them to my email address there, wayne.brough@ahdb.org.uk, and I'll pass them on to the presenters. As I said before, if you wish to pass this webinar on to anybody else, or just sort of revisit it, it will be on our archive site on the website, the AHDB website, next week. And just a quick commercial to look out for further AHDB horticulture webinars. We've got a couple planned in January, one on downy mildew in cut flower column stalks, and one about robustness of our IPM spray programs a week afterwards. So that's the 21st and the 26th of January next year. So with that, I wish you all a pleasant evening and thank you for joining us on this particular webinar. Thank you.